Go. Thanks so much. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Frank Roddy. And we have a small group here and an equally small group online.
Slightly more
So
online.
I'd like to make it informal. Please feel free to ask me questions and I'll try to answer them.
Frank, I think you do want to move the microphone away from your mouth just a little bit there. That's probably better.
Okay,
Thank you. Sorry.
that too.
That's perfect.
Okay. Then if I'm going to cover it a little bit later, I'll just say hold off a little bit and we'll get to that. But okay, so I was born and raised in DC. So I didn't know anything about these things out west. And I got a job with the Department of Energy out in southeastern Washington State. And it was at the Hanford site that was used to make plutonium for the atomic bombs. Okay. And my job was to not make any of that, but to clean up the place and make sure the guys didn't inhale any of this plutonium. Anyhow, so when I was a newbie and the guy was taking me around on a tour, and I saw these rows of gravel all lined up. And I said, I know that the United States government was working really hard to get these things built as fast as possible. But what the heck were they doing there? What does this have to do with the atomic bomb? Oh, it has nothing to do with the atomic bomb. Those are mysterious moolies the Walla Walla Indians found. What the heck is that? Well, what you have to do is you have to go to the library. The Richland Library has the last remaining copy of the book by J. Harlan Bretz on the Ice Age floods. Ice Age floods. What are you talking about? Well, you tell them that you work for the Department of Energy. They guard that book like it's a Gutenberg Bible, but they'll let you take it out for a week. But you got to treat it carefully. So why don't you just copy? Well, anyhow, so that started me out on this investigation. And I took a number of pictures. They have people there that have clubs and they have tours. They put you on a bus and they take you all around the area. They're showing all these sites we're going to see. And I use a lot of my pictures, but I've used pictures from everybody else. So I'm going to give them credit too. I mean, I didn't do much, but the guy in charge really was a guy by the name of J. Harlan Bretz. So anyway, this is the Ice Age Floods National Geological Trail. It's really a national park consisting of 51 non-connected, non-contiguous pieces. It's not all together, but they pretty much follow along the path of the Ice Age floods. This started at 1918 or so and continued throughout the 20th century. And there's a lot of controversy about this thing. And so finally, they formed this new national park, the Ice Age Floods National Geological Trail in 1994. And let's get started on what's going on here. Okay. Bruce Bornstad is a scientist for the Pacific National Laboratory at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory at the Hanford site, and they work on scientific things. So he's a geologist. He wrote a book, and this book really is a guide. The book by J. Harlan Bretz, the guy who did the theory part, is more geology and it's more difficult for us to read. But this other guide is just as a simple, here's where it is, here are the maps, here's how to get there, where you can walk around, where you can drive, and all that kind of stuff. So Bruce Bornstad did that, and I'll show you his book. And Ice Age clubs have gone and taken people on tours on buses. J. Harlan Bretz, who I mentioned, and I've got some road maps here to show you essentially where we're talking about. So J. Harlan Bretz was a geologist, lived about almost 100 years. And he was not recognized until 2 years before his death or so, because the geologists thought that everything happens very slowly. Like the Grand Canyon was a situation where you had a slow erosion by the Colorado River of the Colorado Plateau. It took that 1.5 billion years to cut down that mile or so. He said, these things that I find out here in the Pacific Northwest are just can't happen that way. And we'll see why. Okay, so here's a picture of Mr. Bretz. And let's get started. So first of all, Washington and Oregon are islands that smack into Idaho. They're not part of the United States all this time. They started colliding with Idaho approximately 35 million years ago, and then between 17 and 15 million years ago, created large lava flows over there. So the lava cools down, freezes, becomes basalt. So the basic rock is basalt. So they noted that east of Hell's Canyon, where Idaho is, you have dinosaurs. West of that, you have coral with basalt on top. So basic rock is basalt. Now, here is the area where you had all this lava flow. Here's Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, and the Hell's Canyon is right here along this area, but this covers, I don't know, certainly thousands of square miles covered with lava flow. That it just goes into basalt. And here are versions along the Columbia River. You can see there are multiple layers here, some thicker than others, but so over millions of years, between 17 and 15 million years ago, you have all these lava flows. And another picture along Columbia River. We're on the Oregon side looking toward Washington. And we're again looking toward Washington. Now, Mr. Brett says, okay, I'm finding these weird things that have occurred. Evidence of massive, just absolutely catastrophic flooding high above the current the Columbia River Valley. So it can't be slow erosion. It's got to be something weird going on. And we're going to go through these one by one. The Dry Falls, there's a Dry Falls State Park in Washington. The dry channels in Washington. Erratics, boulders made of sediment or rock from faraway Missoula, Montana, and Salt Lake City, Utah. How did these boulders get here? They're not basalt. They're lying on top of the basalt. So they had to be transported from these places. The nearest place where you find the granite and the quartz is up at Missoula, way to the east, 500 miles to the east. And these are gigantic boulders. We're going to see some of these. Those are called erratics. So let's take a look at the Dry Falls first. We'll see pictures in a moment. Dry Falls are 6 miles across. They are 1,500 feet above the Columbia River, but they're not in the Columbia River Valley at all. They're separate from that. So 1,200 foot high dry cliff right now. There's a deep plunge pool there and a 25-mile channel that the geologists found was formed in 48 hours, 25 miles. Compare that to the Niagara Falls, 160 feet high now, 6 million cubic feet per minute now, 7-mile channel formed in 20,000 years. This thing was much longer than that, formed in 2 days. What the heck is going on here? Okay, Columbia River is up here, and then it doesn't come this way. It goes around up this way and then it comes down around there, and we'll see that a little later. But here you have the 6-mile wide Dry Falls, big plunge pool. That's an aerial view. Here's my picture from the visitor center at the Dry Falls State Park. And it's a huge curved cliff there, 1,200 feet high, plunge pool. And here's the gorge starting down that 25-mile path. Where does it go? Does it go back to the Columbia River? No, it goes across the central part of Washington State, high and dry. This is an artist view of how it would be. That jumps up from the Columbia River, goes up over the top of the ridge there. It comes across and creates these falls here, and it creates boat-shaped formations of the basalt there, where we'll see in a few pictures a little bit later here. And these are called scablands, which is scoured off all of the topsoil and created these channels, these big channels in there. We'll talk about that. We'll see more pictures of that. So we're going to talk about dry channels, coulees, potholes, the basalt columns, erratics, the rocks that don't match what they're sitting on there, flood deposits, and ripples. First, the Drumheller channels. So in northeastern Washington, you've got these channels, boat-shaped sort of, that show that there's massive flooding occurred that ripped the columns off of the face of the cliffs here. The basalt, when it freezes up, forms, it shrinks, and it forms the pentagonal or hexagonal columns. You heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland and so on. That's sort of the way it is along here. But this is all high and dry, nowhere near the Columbia River. How could that have occurred? These are massive floods, massive floods. And so another picture of that type of formation. And here's another big boat-shaped column of basalt.
When you say boat-shaped, what do you mean?
Okay. It shows a prow of a boat, and it is as if the water hit that and went around it, and it's more rounded on the downstream side. And this is Steamboat Rock. It's out high and dry in the middle of nowhere, but it's obviously been caused by massive floods. It's a state park right now. There's camping there and everything.
So that big drop falls area, just to be clear, that formed in 2 days? Is that what they're saying?
Well,
That big?
the big channel at Dry Falls apparently formed in 2 days. But as we'll see, these floods occurred many, many times. Total about 70 times coming out of Missoula and about 30 times coming out of Salt Lake City, the Great Bonneville, Lake Bonneville, which is now shrunk down much smaller to what we call the Great Salt Lake now. Okay. Here's Moses Coulee down near Moses Lake. The water swirled around and created a circular area, and then it drained out down that way. And again, something created a swirling action, cutting off the basalt columns and just clearing them out. And here you can see some of these columns, and they go straight down. When they're cut off at the base, the whole column would topple over and just be pushed down there. Potholes Coulee. Potholes show the basalt here and something harder, some other rocks have been swirled around and kind of drilled or ground their way through the hard basalt, namely the harder granite coming from Missoula, Montana.
About how large is each of those potholes?
Well, these ones are relatively small. They're only 100 feet across. But here's a great big one. It's somewhere between a pothole and a coulee.
All right, what's a coulee?
Okay. It's kind of a roundish area with the vertical sides on it. Okay. When a river goes through, like the Grand Canyon, it creates a V-shaped notch. But these are circular things indicating there's kind of a whirlpool going around, and there's some kind of rocks in there as well, boulders that are smashing into the columns, breaking them off at the base and creating vertical sidewalls. So coulee is kind of a circular formation, a circular valley. It's very unlike slow erosion. And so all of these things are going through this guy's mind, okay? And all the other geologists are on the other side of the fence. They're saying, no. Slow erosion, think slow, eons and eons. Okay, so here's some more basalt columns and some along the Columbia River. Now, erratics. These are rocks made of a composition totally different from the basalt. Composition, in some cases, granite or quartz coming from the nearest place, Missoula, Montana. How did it get here? Hundreds of miles away, way up above the Columbia River. Okay. So you see the rocks here. You see the row of trees back there? That's where the river is. But in some cases, it's much higher than this. This is only a couple hundred feet above the river. And the rocks get bigger. The river is way down where the trees are there. See that? A couple miles away. And some of these rocks are gigantic boulders.
There's a question on the Zoom chat.
Okay.
Would these formations have been mentioned by Lewis and Clark?
No, they did not get this far. They came across through the Snake, from the Snake River to the junction of the Columbia with the Yakima and the Snake at Kennewick, Washington in 1805, but they didn't see any of this. And they were not expert geologists and they didn't recognize any of that. But okay, and you see that woman there? How did that gigantic boulder get there? Somewhere in his book, Hanson Brett's described the largest erratic is about the size of an aircraft carrier, greater than 1,000 feet long, 200 feet wide, and 100 feet thick. This isn't that big, but the guys were originally telling Hanson Brett, well, the Indians put these things in their canoes and yeah, right, sure, right. So here's another one. Here's the river back down here, and here are these guys out there, and this is one of my pictures. And this is another of my pictures. This one happens to be from Lake Bonneville.
So they're just sitting on a surface.
They're sitting on the surface, and the guys trying to clear the fields have to clear all these doggone boulders out of the way. It's just well nigh impossible. They grow winter wheat there in eastern Washington called the Palouse area. The moisture they get is snow in the winter. So they plant the Durham wheat there, and that's okay. And here's another woman standing in front of a great big boulder, but here's the river down closer here. Now, some of these rocks, especially the boulders are 1,200 feet above the river, something like that. We'll see. We'll talk about that some more. Flood deposits. Okay. All this soil came from Lake Bonneville down at where Salt Lake City is. All this came from Missoula, Montana. It's obviously not the same stuff as the basalt. And here's another picture. The two completely different formations on top of the existing basalt. Ripples. Okay, when you go to the beach, you stand on the sandbar, and you know the sandbars move around a bit, and there's ripples under your toes there that you can feel caused by the waves. These ripples, the ones on the Hanford site, were 300 feet high and 6 miles across. Okay, what kind of a wave, what size of a wave would cause that? All these things are going through Brett's mind, and these other guys are saying slow erosion. So he said, no, can't be, no way. It's got to be massive flooding. More ripples along the Columbia, and some snow out there. Really nice. Anyway, here's the quandary. There's no source of these huge quantities of waters. There's no lake at Missoula. Going to see pictures of that. There's no exit from the Great Salt Lake. There's no river going out of there. All the water is melt water from the Wasatch Range, goes down into that basin there and stays there until it evaporates and leaves the salt behind. Okay. What possibly could cause the gigantic falls, this erosion, transported these boulders? This is going through his mind. He was riding around on a horse in 1918 and through the early 1920s. And he just couldn't figure it out. It was really a puzzle. No one else could figure it out, but he worked on it. Okay, so the questions they would say, okay, Mr. Betts, where's the lake? Where's the dam? And how could the dam suddenly fail to cause a massive flood? After World War II, scientists with their modern computers were able to calculate that the lake must have released 500 cubic miles of water all at once. That's like saying Atlas, while he's standing on top of that tortoise, just shrugged, you know. He dumped out the equivalent of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario all at the same time, just turned them over and dumped them all at once, instantaneously, essentially. How could that possibly happen? There's no lake there.
There was a request here. Can you remind us the full name of the geologist that you?
J. Harlan, Harlen, Bretz, Bretz.
Thank you.
The guys were sandbagging him. They knew something fishy was going on at Missoula, Montana. They didn't understand it. They couldn't explain it, but they didn't want to tell him because that would boost his story, not theirs. It undercut theirs. Now, forget this plaque there that the National Park Service put in 1994. But you look out at Missoula, Montana, where's the lake? Okay, where's the lake? So there was evidence of a lake. There are multiple levels of shorelines on the mountains surrounding Missoula, Montana. The highest shoreline, about a mile above the valley floor. The width of the valley there is about 2 miles. What could cause these multiple shorelines? The guys knew about this, but didn't tell Bretz about it. And you can see these, strand is a German word for beach. So you have sandy beaches at each one of these lines here. And look at this. Look at those beaches kind of marching up the side of the mountain like that. All these beaches. And if you cut into the beach, or cut into each one of these little hills, you have what they call a varve, V-A-R-V-E. These are annual depositions like rings on a tree, but these are silt depositions from the lake. You're getting more melting of the ice. Now, I should explain, of course, they didn't know a whole lot about the ice ages and the glaciers right about 1900. They were just still learning about that. They didn't know anything about plate tectonics and all that stuff. But anyhow, so you're having these annual rings, layers built up of the strata, because you're getting melts going on during the summertime, more so. And it builds up, and then you got the sandy beach up here where the grass is growing, and then suddenly it drops down to a lower level. So the first flood probably would be the highest sandy beach. Then the next flood that went down lower and lower and lower as the ice ages, the glaciers get melted. Now, in the 1930s, J. Harlan Bretz heard about the Icelandic term Geological, the glacial outburst flood. What happens is that in Iceland, you have plenty of ice, of course, but you have volcanoes. And the volcano rock is hot, and it melts the ice underneath that glacier. And it builds up and builds up and builds up to the point where it gets enough depth of water to lift that glacier up, and the water slides in underneath as a lubricant, and the whole thing comes roaring down the mountain. It's called the Geological, glacial outburst flood. Have we had any here in the United States? Well, the most recent one that I know of was in 1998 on the northwest side of Mount Rainier. It wiped out the campground, the roads to the campground there. It's too dangerous. They won't let you go there anymore. I don't have pictures of that, but I do have pictures of one that occurred in 1963 on the eastern side. The White River campgrounds were just about wiped out. 14 million cubic meters of material came down off of Tahoma Peak, a small peak there, and roared down 7 miles and just took out all the trees, made kind of vertical sidewalls of clear glacial moraine on both sides and down the terminal moraine at the end. But that's for another talk. So what about these glaciers plugging that 2-mile valley in Missoula, Montana? Well, what about if you had enough water, meltwater behind the glacier to suddenly float it? If you start out with one ice cube in a glass and start pouring in water, that cube sits on the bottom until the water gets almost up to the top of the ice cube. And at that point, it floats the ice cube, okay? So the water is a little bit denser than ice. And so the only thing you see is the tip of the iceberg sitting up above there. Okay, all right. So he said, well, okay. Here's the concept. You have meltwater building up behind ice dam. Here's the glacier coming down out of Canada. It's a huge glacier in some cases 2 miles thick, some cases maybe only 1 mile thick. And this depth here is about 1 mile from what we know from those beach lines at Lake Missoula. And you just get it floating up, and then the water gets underneath, lubricates the whole thing, and just goes roaring down. And so what happened was that here's the Montana-Idaho state line here. Here's Missoula over here. And the water built up like that. Sandpoint, Idaho is 33 miles from the Montana line. And they figured out that this whole ice jam there just blew apart in less than a half hour. So the water was roaring out of here, starting out 1 mile high, 2 miles across, and going at roughly 60 miles an hour, a mile a minute. Ran across northern part of Idaho. Here's the border with Washington State. But back to Missoula, we've got these beach lines here from aerial view. Here's Interstate 90 coming through here. And another view, Interstate 90. Another artist concept of what the ice dam might have been with the water building up behind it. And another one. I think there'd be a lot more icebergs in this thing than they show here, but okay. So right now you only have this little Clark Fork river going through there, just a small one. No lake. So Missoula, the floods went up here, up to Clark Fork. Here's I-90 going through from Montana to Idaho. Goes across here north of Spokane, and it spreads out here. It's about 2,000 feet deep, 30 to 50 miles across, still going at 60 miles an hour. 500 cubic mile, the total volume of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, all dumped at once. Okay, so it came across the northeast section of Washington here, created all those scab lands, all that drumheller channels and all that kind of stuff. So here's the Columbia River coming out of Canada from meltwater from the Rockies, and it builds up now behind Cooley Dam called Lake Roosevelt. And then Columbia River goes this way. This is the normal pathway of the Columbia River, 50 miles to the west. Well, this stuff just kept roaring across the central part of Washington State. Here's that Steamboat Rock State Park right here. There's still some ponds and lakes here. And then the Dry Falls right here, Dry Falls State Park here. And then this is all dry here, bone dry. It comes down across through Moses Lake, Potholes Reservoir here. Now here's the Department of Energy site at Hanford. Anyway, the Columbia River comes here, goes like this, and bends, and now it heads for the Pacific Ocean. Here's Oregon, here's Washington State, Idaho's over here. So this is 50 miles. This is from Kennewick down here, it's 30 miles. So we'll see some close-ups here. We lived right here underneath the W, right about there. Anyhow, so the river comes down this way, but the floods just came across the land right here. And there's a choke point. First, a choke point up here at Sentinel Gap, and another one at Wallula Gap down here. We'll show you pictures of those. Anyway, it came down and then got to Portland, formed another lake down here. Tried to get out the Columbia River mouth here at Astoria, but couldn't do that because of ice. Went up here to Hoquiam and went along what is now the Chehalis River over the hills and out in the Pacific Ocean there. And this is another view. So it couldn't get out Puget Sound because of ice. Couldn't get out the mouth of the Columbia here. So it went up and then out this way, right here. This is Olympic Peninsula, all mountainous. Another lake formed here along the Willamette River at Portland. Earlier than the floods coming out of Missoula, you had the floods coming out of Salt Lake City, Lake Bonneville, because that's farther south, the glaciers are going to melt there first. So how did it get out of, well, Lake Bonneville, we'll see, covered this whole area here. Here's the Great Salt Lake now. Well, it went over a small, kind of a soft canyon going up this way, not a sharp canyon at all, along I-84, that route I-84 takes. And it came up Salt Lake City, came here and went to, this is the Snake River, and went by Twin Falls here. Does anybody recognize Twin Falls for anything in particular? Remember that idiot, Evel Knievel, who tried to fly across it in a rocket?
Oh, yeah.
It's about 500 feet deep, vertical sides, and about a mile across. Well, halfway across, he bailed out with his parachute, and his motorcycle fell in the water on rocks down there. But anyhow, he survived. Anyhow, the water went up this way along the path that I-84 follows into Oregon, at Ontario, Oregon, up this way, and then finally connects to the Columbia River right about Boardman, Oregon. And here's the answer. So I didn't show you this at the beginning. The Cordilleran ice sheet came down from Canada, covered much of the Northwest there. Here's Lake Missoula building up. Here's where the ice dam was at the Montana-Idaho line. Sandpoint is right here. So this whole ice dam, 30 miles or so, 33 miles, just blew apart in about a half hour. The water went up here. Now, Columbia River comes down here. Currently goes this, follows this blue route. Comes down like that to, here's the real coastline, today's coastline. Here's the previous coastline during the ice ages. Okay. And here's the scablands and all those channels and coulees, potholes. So it formed a temporary lake here called Lake Lewis after it got through Sentinel Gap. And there's a small one that goes up toward Yakima, along the Yakima River Valley. And then another one formed near where Boardman is, and then one along the Willamette River Valley here. And here's another picture. So they don't call it Lake Willamette there, they call it Lake Allison. But anyhow, Lake Lewis is where we were. So we'd be, our home, Elizabeth and I lived right about there at Kennewick. And here's that floodwater superimposed on today's towns. Town of Kennewick, Richland, Pasco, called the Tri-Cities. And the DOE Hanford site is right here. So Lake Lewis had a depth of about 1,200 feet, volume about 400 cubic miles, equivalent to Lake Ontario. But Lake Missoula was about 500 cubic miles. That included the volume of Lake Erie as well. And it was held up by some gap in the rocks called Wallula Gap here. And in joining it, there was another one. I'll show you, a Sentinel Gap farther up. Here's Lake Bonneville superimposed on Utah. The dark part is the existing Great Salt Lake now. And that flow of water came up this way, where Interstate 84 now goes. And all of the topsoil from Washington was dumped out here in these underwater channels, and they sampled those to show that the stuff came from Missoula, Montana, and Washington State.
But wait a minute, you
Oh.
showed that the current mouth of the Columbia, right? Not up into Canada.
Okay. No, it wasn't up into Canada. It couldn't get up through Puget Sound, so it really went out here.
Oh, this is Lake Bonneville.
No, well, no.
The,
All the floods, Lake Bonneville's floods joined with the Lake Missoula floods right about here where they both joined at the Columbia River,
okay.
the existing Columbia River. This should really be up a little bit, up about here. Okay. I've seen satellite photos, but I don't have any of those. You can see it. You can see the fan, the topsoil. So Sentinel Gap floodwaters are 2,000 feet high, about 30 miles across. Here's the view from the north. Rattlesnake Mountain, 3,600 feet, and Saddle Mountain, top was Wauhega's Peak, 2,900 feet. Most of this ridge here, we'll see, is about 2,300 feet. I said it's 3,600. From the south, Sentinel Gap on this side is the Saddle Mountain of 2,900 feet and Rattlesnake Mountain of 3,600 feet. It's looking north now. So here you are, you're a caveman, 10,000, 14,000 years ago. You're standing on White Bluffs, the eastern side of the Columbia River, where it turns south. The Hanford site is right here. Here's the Columbia River going by, and you can see multiple layers here. Each one of these represents a flood. And this is Saddle Mountain Ridge here. It's 2,300 feet, more or less, all the way across. You're standing there, and suddenly the animals start running crazy. They're running around, they don't know what's going on, and you can't figure out what's going on. And then suddenly you can feel vibration as if there's an earthquake of some kind. And then you hear this roaring, hellacious noise. And all of a sudden, the run-up of the 2,000-foot deep thing comes right over the top of this whole ridge. Just roars right over the top of the whole ridge, coming at you at 60 miles an hour. You're toast, absolute toast. So all these people were killed. They would be along the Columbia because they were fishing for salmon. They had a big food source. So they would come back, and the next flood would get them. And they'd come back, and the next flood would get them. So this is an artist concept of Lake Lewis, which flooded out Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco's on the other side here. Our home would be right about there where this iceberg is. Wallula Gap is down right there. And you can see this is Interstate 82 going up past there. This is Wallula Gap. You got a 2,300-foot ridge on this side and about 2,000 foot on this side. And it's about a mile wide. The water coming down could not get through that gap fast enough. So it built up a Lake Lewis for about 48 hours. And in that time, it just flooded that whole area. So at this point, they asked, okay, Mr. Brett, remember those erratics? Just how did they get there? How did they get all the way from Missoula? How did they get way up high above the river? 1,200 feet above the river, more than that. Next slide. His answer. Icebergs floated the erratic boulders. They floated in these temporary lakes. They ran aground as the lakes drained out. The erratics left the boulders high above the river where they melted. and they were grounded and melted and just deposited these gigantic boulders there.
The icebergs probably would have been part of the ice dam as it gave way.
As it gave way, it was just broken into small parts, but then it carried a large part of all that glacier along with it. The ice cap along with it. So here are the sediment layers in this temporary Lake Lewis, near where we lived. Look at all this. One after another, after another, and after another. So the bars, remember that cut into the hill at Missoula? The bars showed 50 layers per each of the sandbars. So there were about 50 years between each flood. And there were about 70 floods coming out of Missoula.
What is that sediment in those layers? Is that like a clay, a gravel?
Yeah, it's clay. It's clay and gravel. What kind of prehistoric wildlife was wiped out? Columbian mammoths. Columbian mammoths were 1.5 times the size of that elephant they have in the Smithsonian. These guys are 16 feet tall, 16,000 pounds long, hairy ones. They weren't hairless. Early rhinoceroses, camels, and horses. The horses were too small for the Native Americans to ride. So anyhow, but they were all killed, and they've got fossil remains of all these things from that time period. What about the mysterious mooly-moolies that we talked about at the beginning? Those piles of rocks. They were dispositions of standing wave interference patterns. In other words, as the waves bounce off of Saddle Mountain and Rattlesnake Mountain and back and forth, the waves would come together, and where the waves formed a destructive interference pattern, the waves would settle out and not have a lot of turbulence and drop the rocks into a big pile. Where the waves were constructive interference, they would keep the rocks in suspension, and you would have low spots. So scientists just discovered the mooly-moolies on Mars. And the new rover has discovered stromatolites on Mars, which they believe may be fossilized pond scum. There was liquid water on Mars a long time ago, 1.5 billion years ago, when there was warm enough to still have liquid water in large quantities to form these big catastrophic flooding events on Mars at the end of one of their ice ages. And they're going to, the rover has done is taken samples of what they think are stromatolites, put it in capsules, sealed the capsules, left the capsules there. We're going to have to send another rocket to Mars, collect those capsules, bring them back here so we can analyze them to prove whether it's biological or chemical origin to the stromatolites. And here's what the satellite view of the mooly-moolies looks like. So there's ridges of these piles of gravel. We're not allowed to climb on them or do anything because they're considered sacred Native American ground. But the end reactor is right over here. This is an artist's concept of what Portland would look like. Modern buildings weren't there, but 400 feet of water in Lake Willamette would have caused it to look like this had there been buildings. About 100 floods total, 70 from Lake Missoula, 30 floods from Lake Bonneville. 1994, National Park Service formed this new national park, Ice Age Floods National Geological Trail, dedicated this plaque to J. Harlan Bretz, who patiently taught us that catastrophic floods may sometimes play a role in nature's unfolding drama, Ideas without precedent. This is a quote from 1928. Ideas without precedent are generally looked upon with disfavor, and men are shocked if their conceptions of an orderly world are challenged. References. Here's Bruce Bornstad's Ice Age floods. He has all the trails mapped out for you. Walking trails, bike trails, car driving trails, and you can rent, have pilots from the private pilots take you out up on a little private plane on a little aerial tour of the site if you wish. And they have bus tours too. And he had another one. This is farther upstream on the floods. This is the Ice Age Floods National Geological Trail front cover for the handout from the National Park Service. There's another book, Glacial Lake Missoula and its Humongous Floods, David Alt, John Sonishin, Washington's Channeled Scablands. And you can Google Missoula floods or hugefloods.com. So that's it. Thank you for coming, and any more questions? Yes.
Where, roughly speaking, where are they finding the Ice Age fossils?
Okay. 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 No, there are caves. There are caves along the Columbia River where the people at that time, 10,000 years ago, went up there and ate them, and they have the rhinoceros bones still preserved in the caves. The floods didn't wash them out of the caves, but the one behind the mammoth, the Columbian mammoth behind our place, a mile back, is on the Horseheaven Hills. So it's about 1,000 feet above the river. Is buried well, we have some volcanic tuff on top of everything else. Volcanic tuff is just powdery stuff. It looks, under a microscope, it looks like a fried egg. In other words, molten glassy stuff comes out and at 1,200 degrees or so, hits the air and freezes like a egg does when it hits the frying pan and gets fried. This stuff cuts your fingers. People wear gloves to do gardening out there. Otherwise, you get your fingers cut. But they found it. We've been here 9 years. They found it 2 years before we left, I think, and they were working on the dig for a number of years. The farmer, it's a private farm, found this huge tusk like this. Massive, much bigger than anything on that African elephant down in the Smithsonian. And they've got a very good dinosaur national monument that shows a bunch of dinosaurs at the northwest tip of Colorado. But right next to that in Utah, the town in Utah has a University of Utah museum showing Columbian mammoths and the Eohippus horses and the rhinoceros, the camels, and so on that they ate. So we have a lot of the bones, of course, would be swept away and out to the Pacific Ocean. They're just gone. But some of them got buried in the sediments. Some of them were eaten by the men and hidden in the caves and preserved by accident.
What do you think is the time frame first to last?
From about 10,000, excuse me, about 14,000 years ago to about 9,500 years ago. There's a famous Kennewick Man. He was 9,400 years old. Fossils were found there by every summer. They had a big hydroplane meet there on the Columbia River right at Kennewick. And they put the construction plastic fences around, and you have to pay money to get in the fence. College kids were sneaking in around. They, took their shoes off and rolled the pants up, were waiting in the Columbia River. Oh, there's a round rock here. It's a skull. We better not tell the police because we'll be kicked out of the place because we're sneaking in. So they hid it in the bushes, the coyote willows, the red kind of reeds that they have. And they snuck into the hydroplane race. At the end, they told the police. Police went there and they found the rest of the skeleton. He had a Clovis point that had gone through him and lodged in the back part of his hip. And the bone had started growing around it, about 6 months of growth around it. So he didn't die immediately. It apparently caused enough material damage. He died of infection about 6 months after that, but 9,400 years ago. And they found a whole bunch of skeletons there. So they came back, and these were buried there in a cemetery of sorts 9,400 years ago. So it had to be, the last ice age flood had to be just a little bit before that time. So they use carbon date, radioactive carbon 14 is a 1,600-year half-life. They use some potassium 40, a natural radioactive potassium. Then they can use uranium and the uranium decay products. There are about 24 decay products. So they, radioactivity, they can tell how old things are. And they look at the age of the soil there, the rocks around there. They can determine also somewhat what the age was. So latest maybe 9,500 years ago or so. Other questions? Online questions?
Nothing online.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming, and
Thanks so much.
I'd be
Spectacular.
glad to answer any other questions you have.
When you couldn't give you.